I'm going to talk about trauma bonds and cognitive dissonance today. And just making sure my notes are not showing up on the screen. Okay, so I've gotten a lot of questions about trauma bonds. It comes up, kind of a lot in the group and cognitive dissonance. So I thought, let's talk about it. And so what I wanted to talk about today was how they happen and what they are, and then some ideas for how to get through them, because you actually can get through them. It's just really hard and painful. So what a trauma bond is, it's one of the things that can keep you trapped in the marriage. And when you have a trauma bond, it feels like you can't survive without him. There's this intense craving and longing and yearning to be with him, and it just makes it agonizing to leave. And a lot of people think that it's codependency, but it's not codependency. It's completely different than that. I have an article on Are We Codependent, which you might want to read on my website. I don't believe that most of us are codependent. So cognitive dissonance is when you're living with two different realities and they're conflicting realities. Like, oh, he's such a nice guy. Oh, he's not a nice guy. He's definitely abusing me. Maybe he's not abusing me. Oh, all this is actually my fault. Well, maybe it's not my fault. And you start going back and forth. And I can tell you, I lived with that. It was absolutely agonizing. It causes so much confusion and so much stress. And I used to call it switching between realities. I can remember journaling the truth that he was abusing me, and then later reading that journal entry and not believing it, and realizing that I was either deluded when I wrote it, or I was deluded right now reading it because I wasn't believing it and thinking, I am completely crazy. I don't know what reality is. That's how strong cognitive dissonance can affect us. And many times, the cognitive dissonance and the trauma bond will go hand in hand. And I'll talk about that from an example in my life in a minute. So how do trauma bonding and cognitive dissonance happen to us? Well, when we're being abused, there's a lot of brainwashing going on by our husband. He's changing our perception. He's changing the narrative about what reality is. And then, of course, he's using so many tactics. I have that blog post on 25 tactics, or however many they are. Well, all those tactics just cause constant confusion. So sometimes the abuser is acting in ways that seem to be kind and loving, even though that's not who he is or how he feels. And so we're switching back and forth between being treated well and not being treated well. And even if your husband doesn't treat you nicely, the lack of abuse can actually seem like a kindness. So that causes the confusion too. So it's a pretty powerful experience for us emotionally when one day we're being treated lovingly, and next, after being ignored and confused or scorned for a week or a month, or being treated with what seems like some respect, or maybe he's now listening to us after he's been blaming us and criticizing us. Very, very confusing. Well, the abuser is doing this to regroom us, to get us to trust him again, so that he can further abuse us, and ultimately so he can control our thoughts and our perceptions and the narrative of what's going on in the marriage. It's all part of the brainwashing. So this is called intermittent reinforcement. And it actually creates the most intense kind of bond that you can have, because we're always holding out for it to be nice again, for him to be the man we fell in love with originally. We are always holding out for that. And I don't care for studies done on animals personally, but they have done studies on rats. And they've proven that intermittent reinforcement is the most powerful reinforcement. Rats who are given food intermittently when they press a lever will literally keep pressing that lever until they collapse from exhaustion, just to get that reward. Does that sound familiar? So the cycle of abuse is intensely confusing, and especially, emotionally and mentally, but it's also affecting us physically. And this is where the trauma bond comes in, especially. So during the regrooming, or what's known as the honeymoon phase of the abuse cycle, our bodies are producing the most powerful, feel-good, positive hormones that we can possibly make. Our bodies are creating oxytocin and dopamine, and these chemicals are feeding the reward system in our brain, and they make us feel safe, they make us feel loved, and they also calm down the fight and flight response that we're living in, which I talked about in my last video about how trauma affects us. So the abuse has changed our thoughts and emotions and body to such a degree that we can actually start feeling dependent on our abuser for our own ability to feel sane and safe. And that is horrible. It's a horrible place to be, but it causes the agony of the trauma bond. Because after living with the abuse cycle for years, we end up thinking that we have to have that positive, whether it's no abuse or whether it's actually him being loving and kind to us, loving and kind. We think we have to have that again, or we're going to just lose our mind and not be able to survive the pain, because our body needs those chemicals to calm down the trauma. So then when the abuse begins again, or when we try to leave and separate, those chemicals are stopped. We can't get those feel-good chemicals. And so we're actually experiencing a withdrawal that's similar to an addiction withdrawal. Now, I'm not saying we're addicted to him, and I'm not saying we're addicted to abuse. I'm saying that physiologically, we're going through an addiction withdrawal experience that's very, very hard on us physically, which is affecting our emotions and our thoughts. So we really can't underestimate the power of this on both our body and on our emotions. These chemicals have helped us cope with the overwhelming feelings of being abused for years. And so when we don't have those chemicals being created anymore, we really start to panic. And then on top of that, if we're separated and we're trying to leave, we are facing real fear and real stress. I mean, custody and finances and all those changes to our life. And so now we're being flooded with fear hormones. And in the past, we were used to moderating those fear hormones with the feel-good hormones that came with those perceived acts of kindness. But we don't get those anymore. I mean, when we leave, a lot of times our abuser stops acting kindly at all. And so now we have no idea how to moderate the trauma reaction that's going on. So our body's jonesing for a hit of those happy, safe hormones. And it feels like we're never going to get that feeling again outside of him. And it's interesting because on one level, our body has become used to creating chemicals in response to him as an individual person, and is panicking because he's gone. So we have to learn how to create those chemicals from other places and get them from other places in our life. We got a lot of learning to do when we leave. So basically, when we leave, we're just in a storm of pain that's overwhelming us, and we don't have new coping mechanisms yet. I can remember during the separation with my ex, I can remember sitting in my bedroom absolutely in a state of panic, thinking I have to talk to him, I have to talk to him. Now I knew enough about the honeymoon stage, so I knew that I was craving that. And I knew I could never get that again, unless I reconciled with him. And I actually called the local shelter and asked them to talk me down from calling him. I said, I'm jonesing for my ex, and please tell me not to call him. Unfortunately, our shelter or at least that woman was pretty bad, and she said, why can't you call him? He's your husband. Which actually made me so furious that I started explaining to her why I couldn't call him, and when I got off the phone, I had convinced myself that I was not going to call him. But I mean, she shouldn't have said that to me. Let me talk about how trauma bonds and cognitive dissonance can work together. So I'll just give you a story from my own life. During the early separation, there was a week when I was doing somewhat okay, which, I mean, relative to how I am now was nothing, but for then it was okay. I was a little bit okay. And I was able to remember that week that he was really an abuser. And then he deposited some money in my bank account. And I immediately perceived that as an act of kindness. I thought, oh, yes, he does care about me. He does care about our family. Maybe he really isn't an abuser. Maybe he's going to be different now. And, you know, I just went swirling into that whole place, spiraling into the confusion and the doubt, and started feeling completely crazy. But my happy hormones had been triggered. So it was a very confusing place. And I spent several torturous days trying to get myself to remember that he was actually an abuser and that he didn't actually care and that there was some reason behind him depositing that money. But I really, 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 really wanted to have contact with him because I also was feeling the trauma bond. Oh, he's safe. He loves me. So then I found out that he had actually opened up a secret bank account and had cut me off financially. So then that calmed down my cognitive dissonance because I went, okay, typical abuser, he is an abuser. But see, then the fear started coming back. Oh, I really do have to divorce him. What am I going to do? I can't survive. I can't survive without him. And then the trauma bond started to show up again. So I hope that kind of shows how they work together. And, you know, there's just this rage of hormones going on, fueling emotions. And I mean, our emotions are real too. I'm not saying they're not real. So it's just a very big storm going on. So now I want to talk about getting free. So when you leave, expect to be going through hell for many weeks to several months. And prepare for this. Prepare for agonizing pain. I mean, I just have to be honest with you. It'll be different for all of you, but for some of you, it'll be very, very hard. So prepare for that. And now think about what I'm going to talk about next and come up with a plan for how you're going to respond when you get triggered into that desperate longing to see him. One thing you can do is talk to yourself about what's happening and say, okay, this is hormones. I'm jonesing for the feel-good hormones. That's what's going on physiologically. So when you know what's going on, it can help. And remember that that draw is not actually to him and who he is. It's to the chemicals that your body is craving. And your body thinks that if you make peace with him and reconcile, you'll be safe. But that's actually not true because he will continue to abuse you. And remember that this yearning state, this trauma bond, this craving, is not a permanent state. Your brain needs time to recover and to break off that bond and to learn to create those feel-good hormones in different ways. And if you have severe cognitive dissonance where you're continually going back and forth about if he's really abusing you or not, and you keep falling into thinking he's a good guy and he really loves me, that can set off those hormones again and start kind of reset the cycle. And since that's what happened to me, I was triggered with the trauma bond for months and months. But it did get shorter each time, as did the cognitive dissonance and the confusion about whether or not he was abusing me. But I was flipping back and forth for quite a long time. Now, I didn't have a lot of support. All my friends had, pretty much abandoned me. There were no groups like ours. And so I couldn't, get online and say, help, I'm jonesing, or, whatever. I didn't have anyone to really reach out to support, to get support from. And that can really be a big, big help. Having another person remind you about what's going on is wonderful. But also try to remember that every positive contact that you have with him will kind of reset that cycle. So limit your contact if you can. Go no contact if you can. And if you have to have contact, try to really gray rock. If you don't know what that is, you can search in our group. We've had lots of discussions about it, because that will keep you emotionally disengaged from him. I mean, this is all kind of theoretical. I'm not saying it's easy. I'm just saying if you can do these things, it will help. But this is a struggle. It's real. So remember that with the trauma bond, you're going to be prone to recall the positive more than the negative about him. So just remember that. And then recognize that you're vulnerable to this dream-like state that's warping how you view him and how you remember him, because your mind's going to want to go back to all the positive stuff, which is not actually real. And so make a commitment to yourself to live in reality. That's a really important commitment, to live in reality and to live in truth. And if you start to fantasize about what could be, and if only he would change, and if only you could reconcile, try to stop yourself from that. And, get a book, read a book like In Sheep's Clothing, or a good book that you enjoy that will help you remember what you're actually really dealing with here. And, walking in truth is key. And remember that Jesus is the truth. And when you walk in truth, he shows up in your life in really, really amazing ways. So you can rely on him too, obviously. Okay, next, commit to start feeling your emotions. And when you're tempted to reach out to him for reassurance, get out your journal and start writing. Write whatever you want, write the feelings out, but also write, okay, I'm gonna take care of myself today. I'm going to sit down and feel these feelings instead. I'm going to teach myself how to feel my way through this. Those are the kind of commitments that you want to make to yourself so that you can start gaining that inner strength and that ability to be your best friend and give yourself the reassurance and the calming that you need to get through this. So try to not run from your emotions and avoid them or make them go away. If you feel them, they will eventually diminish, not instantly. It doesn't work that way. But you have to go through the emotions to get out of them. So the next thing I would say is think about the hooks. So there's that keep you hooked to him. There are positive hooks and there are negative hooks. So on the positive hook, what is the illusion or the fantasy that keeps drawing you back? What is the fantasy that you're hooked into? What is it you think you're going to get from him? Or like, what were promises that he made to you? And then write down all the ways that positive hook was never ever fulfilled in real life. Remind yourself of truth. And then on the negative side, what are the fears that you're facing? What is it that you think you're losing? I mean, you are losing real things. There's truth to this. You're losing the dream of a happy marriage, the dream of a family, the dream of growing old with somebody, so many other things that are real that we lose. But also there might be some deep unmet need that you have. For me, I think the biggest hook I had, besides those dreams that I just mentioned, was to be taken care of financially. That was something that kept me hooked to him, even though he was a terrible provider. But I still had the fantasy that he would take care of me, because I was homeschooling and I didn't want to have to work. So once you identify what that unmet need is, and it could be an emotional need as well, you can get down to the business of grieving it and saying goodbye to him ever meeting that need, because he's not going to. So part of committing to feeling your emotions is committing to the grief. And the grief is real. And I'll tell you, breaking this trauma bond could be and leaving your marriage is probably one of the hardest things you'll ever have to do in your life. And so face the reality of what you're losing and what you're going through. I mean, it's a ton of grief. I made a commitment when I separated that I was going to cry and grieve every single day. It was hard because I was homeschooling and my son was home a lot. But I would set aside a time when I could, and I would play music that would cause me to cry and bring up that longing. And I would cry. I had a picture of my ex that I would look at, and some days I'd be screaming at that picture saying, "How dare you? How can you do this to me?" Other days I'd be crying and missing him. I was just letting myself feel whatever I was feeling. And I started noticing that on days that I didn't take the time to do that, you know, by late afternoon I was feeling super tense and uptight and awful. And then if I would just let myself go into my room, sometimes I had to be in my closet with blankets over my head so my son wouldn't hear me, and cry, then, you know, a little bit of that would ease up. But it's a long process. See, if you're still with him and you're trying to break the trauma bond, try to live in real time. Notice what's happening in your feelings. Notice how trapped you feel. Notice how unloved you feel. Notice how much of yourself you've lost. And stop, you know, hoping and waiting for him to change, and just focus on how he's actually affecting you. And that will start to help your body understand that the feel-good hormones that you're getting from him are not, the hormones are real, but they're not coming from a real place, a real situation, because he's not actually really caring for you. So it's important, as far as living in truth, to see his kindness and his niceness and his being a good guy as seduction, as regrooming, as illusion. We have to live in the truth of that. And when you long for that good guy again, remember how it plays out in reality. It always leads to more hurt, more pain, more abuse. Write it out. You know, you can write out, this is what I'm longing, but last time I felt this way, this is what happened. Keep reminding yourself of the truth. And if you're still in the relationship and you can't leave yet, at least face reality and walk in truth as much as possible. Another point I want to make is that trauma bonds can be triggered by empathy for him. So it's important to read the books that remind you that his abuse is intentional, that he knows what he's doing, and that he can stop abusing you whenever he wants. If you start to believe his narrative or some of the narratives that are out there on the internet that he's doing this because he's wounded and he can't help himself, then you're going to have empathy for him and it'll increase your trauma bond. Fear also intensifies a trauma bond, because when we feel fear, we long for those feel-good hormones again and that reassurance from him. So it's important to live one day at a time, one decision at a time. It's important to stop yourself when you're catastrophizing and when you're getting into fear thinking, and put all of your trust in God. If you can. If you can't because of spiritual abuse, I really, really understand that. Put trust in whatever you can, or focus just on today. I mean, I was terrified of the finances of leaving, and I had to trust God for it. And I'm not saying I did that well, but I was trying my best. I was in a panic state all the time about that. Okay, so another thing is focus on compassion and self-compassion and your self-care. And as far as self-compassion, if you're feeling weak and you're feeling yearning and you feel like you're going to call him, or if you end up doing, you know, going back or reconciling or whatever, don't berate yourself. Don't beat yourself up. Talk to yourself in a compassionate, understanding tone of voice, and really try to understand this battle is real and it's huge, and it's okay if you fail. You'll get there. You'll get stronger, and you'll get there eventually. And remind yourself that so much of what's going on is physiological and it's normal. I mean, I would love if we could just have a show of hands in our group sometime of everybody who went through an agonizing process of breaking their trauma bond and moving out of that cognitive dissonance. Because I would bet it's most of us. So when you're in the middle of it, remember, you're not alone. So many of us have already gone through this. It's totally part of being abused. And, you know, if you can find a really good trauma counselor, that would be awesome. A lot of the stuff I'm going to be teaching in the Arise Healing community will give you tools for breaking off this and working through it as well. So on the positive side, some of the things that you can do is start dreaming about your future. Try to make those dreams as real and vivid and wonderful and creative and dream fulfilling as you can. You know, think about what's life going to be like when he's gone. How are your children going to be? Imagine having a beautiful relationship with your kids and feeling totally safe with Jesus again, and fulfilling dreams in your life that you feel like you can't do right now. And focus on the positive. That will help create hormones that will replace the hormones that you used to get from him. And, you know, what do you want your life to look like in 5 years? Think about that. And then also on the positive, reach out for support. We are here in this group. We understand what you're going through. And if you have people in your life who are caring and loving, spend time with them as much as you can. And don't talk to people who don't get it, because they're just going to say stupid things and trigger you. And we don't need that in our lives. And then also on the positive, anything that you can do to calm your body down and create good hormones from a different source will really help. Things like time with good friends who you feel loved by and you feel known by and you feel seen by. A walk in the woods, being out in nature has been proven to change your brain chemistry. So spending time in the woods, I used to walk in the woods for like an hour every day. That will help. Time with the Lord, if that's a positive thing for you, will completely help and help start creating those positive hormones. Listening to music that makes you feel good will create those hormones. Worship music, Beethoven, the blues, whatever, you know, whatever is you like. Surround yourself with good music. Another thing that creates good hormones is cuddling with a pet. So whether it's a dog or a cat or a horse or whatever other pet you have that you can cuddle with, you know, petting a cat is creating, I think it's oxytocin, might be dopamine, it could be both. And exercising is another way to create those hormones. So think about, how can I create those hormones in other ways so I'm not so dependent on him? And remember that will help the bond dissipate faster, but you know, you're in a real battle. I'm not going to deny that. So prepare yourself for it. Know it's going to end. Understand what the battle is. And realize what you're doing in this battle is you are finding yourself again. You're starting to reclaim what was lost and taken from you. You're starting to grow in your inner strength. And that's the beautiful side of leaving an abusive marriage, is us finding ourselves again and growing. It's absolutely totally wonderful. So it's going to take weeks or months to get through it. Please have compassion on yourself. And remember, there's nothing wrong with you. You don't have a moral failing. This isn't sin. This is a trauma bond. And we've all been through it. It's physiological and it's normal when you're trying to get out of abuse. So the playing things over and over in your mind, if that's a negative thing for you, if it's a positive thing because you're remembering to remember that he's a liar, that's okay. But if it's an obsessive rumination, then that needs some trauma healing, because that obsessive rumination comes from the trauma. Jenny says, grief, so hard to grieve someone who didn't exist. No kidding. I know. You really summed it up right there. Cindy, is trauma bonding a thing or a feeling? Trauma bonding is a combination of our emotions, our mind, and our body all working in concert together to make that bond. So it's the body with the chemicals, it's the feelings. And, you know, in Arise, I'm going to be talking about how the brain is involved in creating feelings. But and we do have real feelings, too. It's very complicated to get into right now. So, yeah, it's a thing. It's real. And it works on our emotions, and it works on our mind, and it works on our brain and body as well. Maybe that's the best way to explain it. He says it's the negative part I'm talking about. I feel stunted in the healing process. Okay, when we feel stunted in the healing process, that means we need trauma work, specifically trauma work, generally speaking. Remember, you're not the problem here. The trauma bond and the cognitive dissonance are normal, and you will get through it. And I love you guys, and I'm so glad you're in the group with me. So I will see you later. Bye-bye.